Imagine a serial killer who murdered 10 million people. For decades, the world hailed him as a philanthropist, a savior, and a saint. He didn't kill with his own hands. He killed with a signature on a piece of paper, hiding behind a mask of charity while turning a vast piece of earth into a living hell. This isn't a fable. This is the true story of King Leopold II of Belgium, a man who desperately wanted a colony to make his small country great, but instead created the largest private crime scene in human history. Our story begins not in the sweltering jungle, but in the cold, marble halls of Brussels in the mid-19th century. Leopold was the heir to the Belgian throne, and he was bored. He looked at his country and he saw a nation that was tiny, neutral, and in his eyes, insignificant. While Britain had India and France had Algeria, Belgium had nothing. Leopold was obsessed. He spent his days scouring maps, reading about the Dutch East Indies, and calculating potential profits. He famously said, "Belgium is small, she is small." He wanted to buy a colony. He tried to buy the Philippines from Spain. They refused. He tried to buy parts of South America. He was rejected. When he became king in 1865, he was a king without an empire, a predator without prey. But Leopold was cunning. He realized if he couldn't conquer a colony with an army, he would steal one with a lie. His gaze turned toward the massive blank space on the maps of Africa, the Congo Basin. It was a region largely unexplored by Europeans, rich in mystery and, Leopold hoped, rich in resources. But he couldn't just invade. The other European powers would stop him. So, he invented a humanitarian crusade. In 1876, he hosted the Brussels Geographic Conference, inviting famous explorers and scientists. He stood before them, a tall, imposing figure, and charmed them with promises of ending the Arab slave trade, of bringing Christianity and commerce to the so-called darkness. He formed the International African Association. It sounded like a charity. It was actually a front for a business where Leopold was the only shareholder. To seize the land, he hired the most famous explorer of the age, Henry Morton Stanley. Stanley was a hitman who had famously found Dr. Livingstone. Leopold sent him back to the Congo with a secret mission: get treaties. For 5 years, Stanley traveled up the Congo River, using guns, gin, and trinkets to trick over 450 tribal chiefs into signing documents they couldn't read. These papers handed over their land, their labor, and their very souls to Leopold's organization. The chiefs thought they were signing friendship pacts. In reality, they were signing away their birthright. Then came Leopold's masterstroke, the Berlin Conference of 1884. European powers sat around a table to divide Africa among themselves like a cake. Leopold didn't even attend. He stayed in Brussels, pulling the strings. He played the British against the French and the French against the Germans. He manipulated the United States, convincing President Chester Arthur that his Congo organization was a noble experiment in free trade. America became the first country to recognize Leopold's claim. By the end of the conference, the world had handed Leopold a personal estate 76 times the size of Belgium. It wasn't a Belgian colony. It was his private property. He named it, with supreme irony, the Congo Free State. For the first few years, the colony lost money, and Leopold was near bankruptcy. But then, an invention changed everything. In 1887, John Boyd Dunlop invented the inflatable rubber tire. Suddenly, the world needed rubber. Bicycles, and eventually automobiles, created a voracious hunger for it. And the Congo was teeming with wild rubber vines. Leopold's debt turned into a gold mine overnight. He issued a decree declaring all vacant land the property of the state. He closed the country to foreign trade, violating the very promises he'd made in Berlin. The horror began in earnest. Leopold created the Force Publique, a private army of African soldiers led by white European officers. Their job wasn't to keep the peace, but to enforce quotas. Every village was given a brutal quota of rubber to harvest. The work was agonizing. Men had to walk for days into the jungle, climb giant trees, and hack at vines. If a village failed to meet its quota, the consequences were medieval. The soldiers used the chichot, a whip of raw hippopotamus hide that chewed skin like a knife. 25 lashes could knock a man unconscious. 100 was often a death sentence. But the cruelty went deeper. To ensure the soldiers weren't wasting ammunition hunting for sport, Leopold's officers demanded proof that every bullet fired had killed a rebel. The proof required was a severed right hand. The basket of severed hands became the terrifying symbol of the Congo Free State. Soldiers who missed their targets or used bullets to hunt for food would shoot the hands off, leaving women and children to present to their officers, just to balance the books. Villages were burned. Women were held hostage in concentration camps to force the men to gather more rubber. The population of the Congo began to collapse. Disease, starvation, and the outright murder wiped out an estimated 10 million people, half the population. While the Congo bled, Belgium blossomed. Leopold used the blood money to build monuments in Brussels. the raw greenhouses, the cinquantenida at Grand Avenues. He was building a legacy on a foundation of bones. He thought he was untouchable. He controlled the press, bribed journalists, and hid behind the cover of charity. But he didn't count on a day. Morel. Morel was a shipping clerk in Liverpool who noticed something strange in the ledgers. Ships arrived from the Congo filled with priceless rubber and ivory, but they returned carrying only guns and ammunition. Said were no more trade goods, no more commerce. Morel realized the truth. The Congo wasn't a trading state. It was a slave state, run on forced labor and maintained by terror. Morel became one of history's first modern investigative journalists. He stood on the docks watching the evidence of genocide unload, and he had decided to speak out. He partnered with Roger Casement, a British diplomat who traveled deep into the Congo, and he wrote a damning official report. They were joined by missionaries like William Shepherd, an African-American who took Kodak cameras into the jungle. For the first time in history, photography became a weapon for human rights. They captured images of children with severed hands, of men scarred by the whip. These photos were projected in magic lantern shows across Europe and the United States, shocking the public. Mark Twain wrote a brilliant satire mocking Leopold. The tide had turned. The man who tricked the world was finally unmasked. Under immense international pressure, Leopold was forced to surrender his private estate. In 1908, the Belgian government annexed the Congo, taking it out of the king's hands. But Leopold remained defiant. Before handing over the colony, he ordered the furnaces in his archives to be lit. For 8 days, they burned the records, the financial ledgers, the military orders, the evidence of his crimes. He said, "You will give them my Congo, but they have no more right to know what he did, sir." Leopold died a year later, in 1909. When his funeral procession moved through the streets of Brussels, the crowd didn't cheer. They booed, they spat at his hearse. The builder king was gone, leaving behind a scarred nation in Africa that would suffer for another century. His story is a terrifying reminder of what happens when greed is unchecked, and when the world chooses to look away from the true cost of its comfort. The rubber that built the tires of the 20th century was harvested by the ghosts of the Congo. Thank you for watching. If you found this story important, please share it so that these forgotten victims are not erased from history. Subscribe for more stories that deserve to be told.